Hi, everyone. We've set up this Being an Engineer podcast as an industry knowledge repository, if you will. We hope it'll be a tool where engineers can learn about and connect with other companies, technologies, people, resources, and opportunities. So make some connections and enjoy the show.
When I'm in a situation that I perceive as scary or especially challenging, I think I'm like, what is the absolute worst that could happen? And then I ask myself, would that be so bad? And most of the time, if I've done the right thing to the best of my ability, then whatever the worst thing happens is usually probably okay.
Hello and welcome to the Being an Engineer podcast. Today, we're speaking with Etienne Nichols, who has a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering and has worked in a variety of industries from aerospace to gear manufacturing to medical devices. Etienne currently works as a community manager for Greenlight Guru, where they make software for managing quality systems and medical device design controls. Etienne, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on. It's good to be with you today.
Great. So what made you decide to become an engineer?
It's a good question. So originally, this is odd. I didn't actually plan to go to college at all. I worked in the family business installing custom window treatments, which who would have thought that's even a possibility to have a job doing that. But when the housing bubble popped and the bottom dropped out of the economy in 2008, I drove to the Tulsa Community College. I walked into the advisor's office and I told them, I need something that pays decent and is stable. And they basically said, we recommend engineering. So I said, sign me up. The type of engineering they had was mechanical engineering. So that's what I did. And that's what I stuck with. Not the most creative way of getting in, but that's how I landed in engineering, believe it or not.
You know, it's kind of shocking to me how roughly common that story is. You know, I guess I figured everyone else had this figured out from the time they were young. You know, my story is very similar, but I've talked with so many people who just kind of fell into it, right? There are, of course, a lot of engineers who did kind of have it figured out from an early age, but I mean, one evening when I was a senior in high school, my dad, we were eating dinner and he says, so what are you going to do in college? And I was like, I don't know. And he says, oh, you should try engineering. So I said, oh, okay, that sounds good. And so I signed up for manufacturing engineering. I had a 2-year hiatus during college. And when I came back from that hiatus, they had eliminated the manufacturing engineering program and it was now mechanical engineering. So I was like, okay, I guess I'll do mechanical engineering, not really even knowing the difference at the point. Anyway, yeah, I kind of fell into it as well, but turned out to be a good thing to fall into.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good, end if that's where you want to go, but it's also a good springboard if you want to go into anything else. I've actually talked to orthopedic surgeons who had an undergrad in mechanical engineering. They feel like it served them well. So, yeah, it's a fantastic degree if you ask me.
I agree 100%. That's a good word to use for it, a springboard degree. It teaches you how to think. And once you know how to think, I mean, you can kind of do anything, right?
Yeah. One of my favorite stories, because you kind of getting me off on this track of knowing how to think. One of my favorite stories from college, I don't think about this too much, but I remember walking into, I think it was an experimental fluid dynamics flow class. And we had an exam and, it was one of those exams where you have 2 questions. And the second one I got to, I'm like, yeah, I have no clue what they want from me, but I recognized the dimensions they wanted at the end, and I knew what all I had with me, on the paper there in the question. And so purely using dimensional analysis, I arrived at the correct answer. Now it's one of the most proud moments I've ever had in my engineering college, life. So, yeah.
Amazing. Well, you had mentioned working for your dad at this window treatment company. How do you think that prepared you maybe for being an engineer? I'll call it, it's a manufacturing company, right? I mean, that's fair to say.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we were providing a service. I was working with my hands. There's a lot of assembly. So I said there are elements of manufacturing, certainly. So I guess if I were to think about how that impacted me from a career standpoint after engineering, it kind of affected me in 2 different ways. Number one, I usually had a customer watching me. They were watching everything I did, maybe having a conversation. It helped me learned to portray a level of confidence that might not have been realistic in the moment. For example, maybe a bracket had broken, or maybe a rod was too short, all things that I might be panicking about on the inside. But I was also having to troubleshoot in my mind while they tell me about their dog who has some strange fetish with just the left shoe and chewing that up, or whatever it is they're telling me at the moment. I'm having to, oh yeah, that's great. I'm thinking, okay, how am I going to get through this? So that was helpful, in one thing. So that was maybe the soft skills side. Another thing that it helped me with, which is tangentially related. I worked by the job. So I got paid by, however quickly I worked, that's how I got paid, which meant there was an incentive to optimize the process. So that was kind of built into the job. If you wanted to make more money, you learned to work faster without sacrificing quality, of course, because then you had to go back and fix it, and that didn't help you at all. So how could I reduce the number of times I go up a ladder? What's the best layout for my work truck so I can access 10% of my tools that I use 90% of the time? What's the tool that, I don't know, for the job that from an efficiency and effectiveness standpoint makes the most sense, whether it's a grinder in the garage or a pipe cutter in the living room, whatever that may be. I was always trying to optimize the process. So that's one thing I think that helped me as well.
That's a phenomenal takeaway. I'm curious, did other folks who were working at your dad's company, did they have that same mindset? Were they trying to optimize everything as well? Or were they like, if it takes me a little longer, then I just don't make quite as much. That's fine.
I think there was a split, I guess. I was probably, I'd had several. So I guess I need to explain the business model just a little bit. So we worked directly with interior designers, and they were the ones who hooked us up with jobs. For lack of just not to go into too much detail, but that's essentially how that worked. They reportedly always said Etienne is the fastest. We want Etienne because he is the fastest. And, so it was hands down just kind of like a non-competition almost, because I just was always thinking of these different ways. There were a few others who did. And anytime I heard of some of the tricks that they had, I immediately put them in my tool bag as well. I was not, my way's the way. It is that you have to have a certain amount of humility in whatever line of work you're doing, so that you can learn to be better. So. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. By the way, can I ask you about your name? I have never met an Etienne before. Where does that come from?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's French for Stephen. And my mom, she picked that up in college. I guess she took French in college and really liked that name. So she stuck me with it. It's been a lifelong practical joke. You say it fantastically. She tells me I don't even say it correctly, so I never judge anyone. But yes.
Well, my last name is Moncoeur, which is I don't know the correct way to pronounce it. It's also French. Apparently, it means my heart. But my brother married a Parisian, and she says it so beautifully, of course, right? And the one who joined our family after the name was given is the one who says it correctly. The rest of us just sound like a bunch of bozos. But interesting, Etienne. French.
It's your name.
Great.
You can say it how you want to, though.
I suppose so. I have some leeway there, right? Yeah, yeah. Like I say it different than my dad, who says it different than my brother, and I don't know. It's just a mix. All right. Well, let's see. At some point later, you were working for an aerospace company, and you spent quite a bit of time machining parts. I mean, you're basically a machinist for some period of time. How did that experience as a machinist help improve your abilities as an engineer?
Yeah. So I was actually, that was an interesting job. I actually got it through Craigslist, believe it or not. I worked for a guy named Paul Wanamaker, one of the best bosses I've ever had. He put me on the machine, even though I was supposed to be an engineer, like a young engineering, guy in there. He said, well, I want you to run this machine. I thought, man, this seems like a waste of time. And he said, don't discount the benefit you'll get from running this machine. So I thought, okay, whatever. I'll run it. And running a 3-axis Bridgeport and email is probably one of the most meditative jobs you will ever have. And it gave me an advantage, I would say, in a few different ways. So first, when I started designing, and he trained me to use SolidWorks and so forth. I'd get there at 6 a.m. and I'd watch him, trying not to fall asleep as he trained me how to use SolidWorks. And we used a little bit of stress analysis. And then I would go machine for a while. When I started designing, it helped me understand what was possible and what was practical, because, some things just aren't possible. Whether it's if you're machining or you're injection molding, whatever your options are for fabrication, some things aren't possible. And then in another sense, some things, maybe they're possible, but they're not practical. And you give them to a machinist that, every engineer who's been an engineer for very long has probably gotten some flack from the guys on the shop floor saying, aren't you supposed to be an engineer? We've all heard that. And so that was the second thing, actually, that I think it helped me with. It gave me some street cred, if that makes any sense.
Nice. Nice.
When I went out to the shop floor.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you've got stories about that as well. So that was fantastic.
Yeah, that's cool. I spent a summer as an intern machining myself, and it was super useful. I don't know if it was as meditative as your experience because I stood right next to this big steel roll-up door, and it was summer in Arizona. It was 115 degrees outside, and the sun was beating down on this door, and it was just dumping heat onto me all summer. But nevertheless, it was a really cool experience to spend, basically 3 months as a machinist. And I didn't really have anyone to show me exactly how to do this stuff, so I had to figure some of that out on my own. It was just a great experience. Right? Learned a lot of things. And like you said, you do have a little bit of street credit, right? Once you know the basics anyway of running a machine. So,
yeah.
Let's see. You have this really cool picture on your LinkedIn profile. It's this massive, massive gear. It looks like it's, I don't know, maybe 6 feet in diameter or something like that. I'm always really curious to hear how really big parts are made. Walk us through that. What was the manufacturing process for this giant 6-foot diameter gear?
Yeah. So that was when I was working at a company called MedTech out of Cincinnati, and there was a steel manufacturing facility where they manufactured parts for steel mills. And so, that was part of a large gear assembly. And that one, if I remember exactly how it was built, it was a fabrication where they had large steel welded together, and then it was put on a grinder to grind those teeth. And the way the grinder worked, it was almost like a 5-axis CNC type of grinder, the way it would grind those teeth down. And the teeth were incredibly smooth. They were then later, that entire piece I'm completely open with you. I can't remember if it was carburized or nitrided. I don't believe it was carburized because I think it was too large of a part. And I don't want to, go too far into that process necessarily, but the MedTech is known for their carburization process, so they're fantastic. They're one of the best in the business for carburizing gear teeth. So I was just kind of peripherally involved with that gear. I had to get my picture taken with it because as a mechanical engineer, having worked with gears, that's kind of your I've reached the summit, so it was
for sure.
It was good.
Yeah. Okay. I have to ask you about carburizing. I'm actually not familiar with that process. What does it mean to carburize a gear tooth?
Okay. So the carburization process of a gear tooth, it hardens. It's essentially a hardening process. So so nitriding is similar. It's a not as deep of a process. So depending on how, you carburize the part, it will go so many thou deep into the steel to harden that tooth. Yeah. So most gear teeth are hardened of some kind, whether it's a nitriding process or a carburization process, and there's a few others as well.
Is it a thermal process? Carburizing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Got it.
It's usually
Cool. All right. Well, you started out as a mechanical engineer in the aerospace industry, then at some point transitioned into MedTech. Tell us a little bit about how that happened.
Yeah. So I had wanted to be in MedTech and really designing medical devices. That was kind of like my goal when I was in college because a few different things. One, I broke my arm in college, and the orthopedic surgeon that I kind of mentioned at the beginning, he actually was the one who was a mechanical engineer originally, and he talked to me about all the physics behind breaking my arm and all that stuff, and what part they were going to put into my arm. So I actually have a 6-inch plate. You probably can't see my scar, but a Synthes Depew with 6 screws is in my arm. So he showed me what it was and the design of it. This is a unique design, and it lets the things breathe and so forth. So it was really cool. So it sparked my desire there. It wasn't for several years before I got into MedTech because, I was living in Oklahoma, And then I just didn't have the experience to do that. There was no MedTech around, at least that I knew of. So when I got to Cincinnati, I was working in the steel industry. An opportunity arose to be a manufacturing engineer at a medical device facility. I had tried to get into J&J as a design engineer. And again, they want a lot of experience, and that's totally fine, totally justifiable. And it's one of the things that I would say, because I do have advice for people who are trying to get into MedTech. And I guess I'll just finish that story. So I took the manufacturing engineer role, and I was just kind of bottom of the barrel, and that was fine. And I worked my way up a little bit. I eventually became a project manager there, got my PMP, and then I did become a product development engineer for a drug delivery combination product company. That said, transitioning, because you asked about transitioning. So transitioning from whether it's a very low regulated industry like steel or a differently regulated industry like the FAA and the role I was in, I didn't even experience any of those regulations. Once you get into MedTech, there are, I'd say, at least 5 different things that I wish I'd known. I wrote down a few different things so that I could try to remember them all. Number 1, the regulations should probably be your first stop for reading, not your last. So when I came to MedTech, I thought, why are we circulating all these things to this guy, that guy, and whatever to be signed off on? When I was in this at the steel manufacturing place, if I saw something that needed to change for this particular assembly, I redlined the drawing, gave it back to the guy who had it up on the lathe. He finished the part, and that was that. I was the guy who made the decision. That is not efficient. The case for efficient until you make a problem, until you make a mistake. So in MedTech, there's something called 21 CFR Part 820.40 document controls that expects you to write what you're changing, justify why you're changing that, and explain how you got from Rev A to Rev B and who is approving those and when. So all of that's required within that regulation. And it's actually not much in the regulation, but you are expected to do that. Now, when you join a MedTech company, they'll have you read SOP after SOP, standard operating procedure, and call you trained, and then you go out and do your thing. Well, that's fantastic. But the rules of those SOPs, they don't always make sense, and they might have been written by someone in a rush. If you understand the regulations, if you just read through them, there's not a lot there, believe it or not. It will make it so much easier to assimilate into the MedTech industry. So first things first, I wish that I had understood those regulations, and I'll just rattle 3 off. So depending on if you're a product development engineer or manufacturing engineer, ISO 13485, just read it. It's 12 pages, something like 13, 14 pages, something like that. ISO 14971, similar size, it's risk management. And then 21 CFR Part 820, the FDA's rules for a medical device company, including the design and development of a medical device. So not a lot of pages to it, but if you read that, it will give you a foundational understanding of why a lot of these SOPs say the things they do. So that's the first one. So I'm going to stop and let you talk though, because I'm rambling. So I'm going to let you talk for a second.
No, this is great. I love the specifics there. And, I think you're good. Just keep going with all 5. You said you had 5 points, right?
I've got 5.
Yeah.
Okay. So the second one is, and this is one every engineer, no matter what industry you're in, this one might be something that you could benefit from. And that is, the problem is more important than the solution. Okay. So the problem is more important than the solution. During the design and development process of a medical device, Part 820.30, as I mentioned, it's a quality system regulation for medical devices. .30 is the specific part that is for design controls. It calls out something called user needs. So, use the design inputs. Later on, it's going to require the validation of those user needs. So what does that mean? Validating a user need is making sure you designed the correct device. It's not making sure you made it correctly. It's not making sure you designed it well. It's making sure you made the correct device for the problem you're trying to solve. So a lot of companies, they fall in love with the technology and they fall in love with their solution. And let's face it, that's an engineer's temptation. Once I've designed the iPhone, I'm like, this is it. It's perfect, isn't it? But then if anyone's familiar with General Magic, the company that they made the iPhone technology before the iPhone became an Apple thing. If that's different reading, but I'll send people a book if they want to, or send you the name of a book if you're interested in that story. They came up with technology before the world was ready. And sometimes that happens. Don't fall in love with the technology, fall in love with the solution. So that's the sum of that one. Okay. The third point that I have is for MedTech companies, especially, good design requires good documentation. So medical devices, they can take a long time to come to fruition. And there usually needs to be a solid justification for any changes that happen along the way. I already mentioned Part 820.40, which is document controls. So learning to embrace documentation, it's a must if you want to succeed in medical devices. So I believe it or not, I was the guy who in our engineering team in college, everybody had their specialty, and I became kind of like the project lead typically. And maybe that was because I was okay speaking publicly, not necessarily that I was the most talented, but it was my job to write the report. And so I always wanted us to look good. But you want to highlight the things you do wrong as well, or they will find the things you do wrong. So you need to learn to document those things and learn to enjoy that documentation.
I have a question here for you. All right. So, this is a question I was going to ask anyway, but this is a good segue into it. You mentioned in a recent, LinkedIn post, I think it was, that I make MedTech regulations fun. And you're talking about the documentation right now. That's part of the regulations for sure. I don't know very many engineers who enjoy documentation. So, this is an impossible question, I realize, but I'm going to ask anyway. How do you make documentation fun?
Yeah. That's a good question. That's a really good question. How do I make documentation? I've always been scared someone's going to ask me that. I put that on LinkedIn, and then, you just wonder,
there you go.
Who's going to ask me? They're going to call me out. Let me take a stab at it. When I think about regulation, regulations are inherently boring, honestly. They're pretty boring. They're typically written in legalese, and they're typically very vague. There's not much there. And that's intentional. I'll get to that in a minute. So, they're written vague and they're boring, but the things that led up to the implementation or the reason that regulation is in place, those are usually not boring. It's usually an incident that happened that now requires this. For example, in 1970, I'm going to get the date wrong, but in 1976, I actually think that was the implementation of the QSR for Part 820. But at some point in our history, in the U.S. history, there's actually a story where the shoe people, the people who are designing shoes and selling shoes, they put a X-ray in their stores, and you would stick your foot in that X-ray, and everybody within a 10-foot radius would get blasted with X-ray while the shoe salesman would look at your foot to see if your bones were crooked, and then they would design a shoe for you, and then you would go on your merry way, albeit with a higher likelihood of having cancer. And they were doing this for everybody who came into these stores. And so that is the reason now the CDRH is called the Center for Devices and Radiological. I'm going to get the acronym incorrect. But let me get the acronym, Center for Devices and Radiological Health. Okay. So I had it correct. Radiological, that came later than the devices side. So that's kind of interesting. And so I like to tell the stories. I'll tell you one more if that's okay.
Please.
And this is one that I just personally like to tell. I think it's just kind of, I get some flack about this, but when I was younger, I rode a motorcycle and I kind of rode a little harder than I should have. I remember one night at 3 a.m., me and a buddy, we got on our motorcycles to see if so we went down to a deserted stretch of highway. And we wanted to see if we could beat 200 miles per hour. Our motorcycle said 200 is what it could do. So that was our user need. We wanted to validate that user need. So
Challenge
we took
accepted.
off. We had a benefit risk analysis in our mind thinking this is worth it. We had risk mitigations in place, leather, helmet. ISO 14971, by the way, mentions 3 risk mitigations that it recommends. Number 1 is inherent safety by design. You cannot hurt yourself with this. That's what they really want you to do. Design something that you just can't hurt yourself with. Okay, well, that was out the window. Risk mitigation number 2 is safety measures. So my helmet, my jacket. And then the third thing is a warning, maybe that goes into the red when you go past 60 miles an hour, whatever. So there's these different risk mitigations. But in my mind, I had this benefit risk analysis that I said, okay, it will be worth it for me to go see if I can go 200 miles per hour. I stopped at 187 because I got to the point where I'm like, it's actually not worth it. And so my benefit risk analysis was wrong. My BRA was wrong. And we hate to say in the medical device industry, we put a BRA out there and it turns out it's wrong, but you need to it's a living document. You have to update these things. So that's one thing that I could go through ISO 14971 and talk about risk management and these different aspects. I'll go one step further though with the motorcycle illustration. If anyone's ever ridden motorcycles, you know, if the curve says 35 miles an hour, you can probably double that. You shouldn't, and I don't recommend any of these practices. This was a long time ago. I don't even own a motorcycle anymore. My wife won't let me.
We should say that the Being an Engineer podcast has no formal affiliation with Etienne Nichols. Anything he says must be.
Okay. That's exactly right. And I hope the statute of limitations has passed. I no longer live in that state. But so if you go around a curve on a motorcycle, typically you look at that sign, it says 45 miles per hour. The FDA would never put up that sign, 45 miles per hour. What the FDA would put up is this curve is X radius or X degrees of a grade or Y steepness or Z surface friction, it would say all those details. And then it would say, are you in a semi? Are you in a motorcycle? What are you? You better know yourself and you go around this curve at a safe speed. Whatever safe is, they might have a definition there. So that's what a medical device company, when they look at the regulations, they say, man, they're vague. I wish it just said 45 miles per hour. No, you don't. Are you a class 3 implantable? Are you a class 1 that can go super fast around that curve? It just depends on the vehicle you're in. So that was a long-winded answer to say I like to make regulations fun, but that's the way I try to do it.
I really appreciate your approach there, bringing in a story, an analogy that kind of all of us can relate to, even though most of us probably have not gone 187 miles an hour on a motorcycle, but we can kind of understand what that would be like and see the analogy that you've created there. That was fun. Thanks for sharing that. I was thinking about this answer a little bit myself as you were talking. And while I would not enjoy doing drawings all day, every day for sure, there is a certain just intrinsic amount of joy that comes from putting together a really clear and concise document that when you hand it off to someone else without any further input from me, the engineer, they can go off and use that document to make something or to follow some process. And I think that a lot of engineers inherently just find joy and value in that process, being able to be super clear and detailed about something and give it off to someone else, and then the process continues without them. That's just I think that's a fun thing inherently.
I like that. I agree.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me take a very short break here, and I'm going to share with the listeners that teampipeline.us is where you can learn more about how we help medical device and other product engineering or manufacturing teams develop turnkey equipment, custom fixtures, and automated machines to characterize, inspect, assemble, manufacture, and perform verification testing on your devices. Etienne, you had your 5-point list, and I think you had gone through 3 of them. Is that right?
That's right. Okay.
Let's share the other 2.
Okay. The 4th one I have is, and this is, again, this might be true for every industry to a certain degree, but it's especially true for medical devices. Maintaining cross-functional awareness is vitally important. So that means you need to maintain a relationship with quality, manufacturing, marketing, maybe even field services, whoever might interact with your device. Really, whether it's assembly, inspection, sales, repair, they might have valuable input. That's never going to reach your ears unless you maintain relationships with someone in that department. So I highly recommend just making sure you network. And I have a quick story about this that I learned early on. I learned this cross-functional relationship thing from being sat in the cursed cubicle that was set directly across from the break room. So anyone who came out of the break room, they would either walk into my cubicle or have to turn left or turn right into the hallway. And because of the way my computer was set, I almost always made eye contact with them. And so they would come in and say, hey, you're the new engineer. No one's ever lasted in this cubicle more than like 2 months. I'm like, really? I started documenting it. I literally had up to 50 people in a single day stopping to say hi. Me as a new engineer, I'm like, I'm not going to make it as an engineer.
How do you get anything done?
You don't. And so the other guy who got hired at the same time as he said, Etienne, if you don't stop talking, I'm like, I can't stop talking. He was going to be, it was just not good. So I got to think about this. I'm like, this is a problem, or it could be the solution. Now I mentioned you don't fall in love with the solution, fall in love with the problem. Well, sometimes the heart of the problem is the seed of the solution. So that's a good phrase a boss told me a long time. The heart of the problem is the seed of the solution. I said to myself, Etienne, everybody's coming to your cubicle. This is a problem. Well, maybe it's not. These are engineers who are coming into my cubicle. Maybe if I'm working on something, I say, hey, how would you do this? So I would immediately, how would you do this? How would you? And they might take my 15-minute task and maybe boil it down to a minute, or say, hey, well, when I get back to my desk, let me send you a template. And my job was done. I was actually starting to get even faster than the other guy. And I sprung board, whatever, if that's a word, past him. And it was because people were coming to my cubicle, and I pretty much decided, you know what? I'm going to keep a spreadsheet, and I'm going to know everybody in this entire building by the end of my 6 months, whatever stint I have and stuff. And it actually worked out really well. So to circle back, that was a lesson I learned. You don't have to go to that extent, but I highly recommend maintaining those relationships with those other departments, because it is going to put you in a better position.
Totally. That reminds me of a quick story here. Let me butt in just for a second.
Yeah,
When
please.
I was in graduate school, we had to do a project that required some parts being machined. And there was a shop there at ASU, at the university, with full-time machinists, right? But I didn't know anyone there. And there was a line of stuff, right? Other students were submitting parts to get made as well. And of course, like anyone, we wanted to get our parts made first, but there was a queue, and we were not at the head of that queue. So anyway, I went and bought a couple boxes of donuts, and I brought them into the machine shop, and I was like, hey guys, here's some donuts. Just wanted to say thank you for, helping us out with this. I didn't even ask them to move us ahead, right? Unfairly. But I gave them a couple boxes of donuts, and I was just nice, and I talked with them for a little while, and lo and behold, we got our parts a lot quicker than we ever should have. So there is definitely value in establishing relationships with other people in different departments, things like that.
Absolutely. And I think, I really see that value in a lot of different ways, but I really want to highlight it too in really understanding how your device is going through the process, whether there are problems in the field, maybe someone is handling those, but it might not be nice for you to know about those problems as well, because maybe there's an easy fix. So there's a lot of those different things that are really, really helpful as well. So, okay, the fifth thing. So we'll get through this. Everybody hang in there. There are resources out there for people to learn more. So, it sounds very generic, but that's really my fifth point. I mentioned that the regulations should probably be the first stop and not the last, because that's a lot of the, and I'm just going to circle back that for just a moment. The reason I started reading regulations and standards is I would get an SOP that was hindering my project. I was a project manager at the time. I'd gotten my PMP, and I was managing this group of engineers, and I thought, we are not going to make our deadline. And so I started reading, why is this the way it is? So, well, it's in the regulations. So I started reading the regulations. No, it's not there. And so I would make my argument. So why do I bring that up? So if I go back, there are resources out there for people to learn from. Sometimes reading the regulations, you might think, well, I'm not exactly sure how would an FDA inspector look at this? What do they actually care about? Well, that's when you do need to go read other things. So number one would be guidance documents that explain government's interpretation of their own regulations. That's very handy. They've given those things to us. So the FDA has very searchable guidance documents. EUMDR, which is the European regulation, they have MDCGs. So it's another version. They're very searchable. There are academies where people can go even deeper on these subjects. So if you're interested in learning more about risk management, from a medical device perspective, ISO 14971, there are lots of different academies out there where you can go even deeper on these subjects. And then one of the third aspect of this, there are professionals who express their opinion on LinkedIn about different subjects. So you might think, LinkedIn, you're recommending a social media. Let me kind of finish here. I recommend curating your feed, because a lot of people might use LinkedIn. They might just have it, whoever they're following. Curate your feed by following or unfollowing people so that you see more posts about your industry instead of just job updates from people that you haven't seen since college. So you're probably consuming a lot of information that you don't even realize. So curate your feeds from industry experts. And I could rattle off names, but feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Happy to tell you who to follow. I'm actually planning to post about that tomorrow. And then the fourth thing I would recommend is industry-specific communities where people are actively discussing the very problem that you may be experiencing. Those are fantastic to reach out to and actually talk to those experts. During one of my times as a manufacturing engineer, I dealt with a kappa on a screw thread. Well, through one of these communities, I actually got on the phone with someone who was the author of the ASTM standard for that screw thread. And I was able to talk to him about this. And I thought, this is fantastic. I can't believe I'm talking to the guy who wrote the ASTM standard on this. And I was able to solve my problem. So those communities are another place that you can get some of those resources.
Oh, that's wonderful. Those are very actionable steps that I think anyone can follow. Super valuable. Thank you for sharing those. Did you think of those just for this, or are these like Etienne's tenets that he's kind of developed over the years?
I thought I don't know if I have a great answer, honestly, for that. I actually just sat down this morning. I thought, okay, I want this to be a profitable conversation for people. So I just jotted down, these are the 5 things I really would like people to be able to take away from. Things that I wish that I personally had known. I'm actually working on a book on something along these lines. So,
oh, cool.
I'll hit you up when it's done. You know how some of those projects go. But anyway,
absolutely, that's great. All right. Well, I'm going to depart a little bit from the MedTech specific conversation and get into a couple of more general questions for you. What is a tool that doesn't exist, but if it did, would allow engineering teams to work better, faster, smarter, and feel free to stray outside the realm of what's known to be physically possible?
Okay. Great question. And I don't know if I'll be able to stray outside the realm of what's known to be physically possible just because
once you're in that box, it's hard to take yourself out of it.
Yeah. I've thought about this before, and the one thing that I think would be really cool, and it might be, I don't know if it's out there or not, but a human factors module within a CAD program, like a computer aided design program, like SolidWorks, for example. If there was a human factors module, you know how, like with stress analysis, it typically shows the stress in a colorized way. So you kind of have a heat map of where the stressors are. What if there was a human body, whether it's a 99% female or 50% male, whichever one, or 50% female, 99% male. We had to do that actually with destructive testing and custom aircraft interior, which when I worked in aerospace, that's what we did. We actually built out a frame with the door that simulated the forces on the door for it was actually a helicopter. I don't remember the specific, it was like R-134. I don't remember what it was exactly, but we actually had to find a big dude to fit through this door to make sure he physically could, and then a small woman to be in there to break down the door to make sure she physically could. We had to validate that model using them. And so that was an interesting thing. It would be interesting if to go back to more of a that might be, sure, you can simulate that with just a force. Just put a point load on the door and that's fine. You can tell whether or not it's going to break. That's fine. You can do that in SolidWorks. That's easy. But what if, like with human factors, like in the ergonomics of a handle, like you actually had my hand modeled and the things that my hands could do. And then when you put your product in my hand, it had kind of a stressor or a heat map to say, well, there's more force based on this hand. So
that's a great idea. I've never heard that one before. I love it. Very cool.
Someone steal that and just at least mention me. Since that's fine.
Send some royalty checks if you can.
Yeah.
All right. This next one, I always think it's kind of a weird question, but I also think it brings up such interesting stories and examples that I love asking it. So what is the most scared you've ever been? And this can be professional, it can be personal, whatever you want. Take it whatever direction you want. So what's the most scared you've ever been? How did you handle the situation and what did you learn from it?
That's a good question. It has a lot of good aspects, like what I learned from it. When I think about the most scared I've ever been, the thing that jumps out to me was a friend of mine and I randomly went skydiving one time. And when we decided to go skydiving, it wasn't the typical first time. At least, a lot of people I hear, okay, yeah, I was attached to an instructor. I was not attached to an instructor. I jumped
Solo.
IAD. Yeah,
Wow.
It was a solo flight on this tiny Cessna 152, 172, whatever it was. And so you actually, you sat next to the door, they open the door, and you actually crawl out onto the wing and you dangle until they give you the thumbs up, and then you let go. And so,
okay, Tom Cruise. Yeah.
Yeah. So they open the door, and this is just a little place in Podunk, Missouri. I'm not sure if this is a normal way of doing it. I don't know, but not necessarily recommended. But I said, okay, the other thing about this was they showed us pictures of people falling and dying. There's like, we want you to know what you could potentially get into. I'm like, I can't believe we're actually going to do this. I was the smallest, so I was the last one to jump. When my friends jumped, I thought, I'm going to die. I get to the door, they open the door, and I look down. I'm like, yep, it's over. They said, climb out. And I said, okay, well, I paid for this. I have to. It's ridiculous. So I'm dangling. And the thought literally came through my mind that said, when they gave the thumbs up, the thought literally went through my mind. If I let go, I am a dead man. But they told us they won't let us back in. They'll shove you out because it's too dangerous.
You're kidding.
To crawl back in. So I thought, I have to let go. And if I do, I'm a dead man. And then I thought, I guess that's okay. And then I thought, I wonder what's on the other side. I basically, I let go. And honestly, I have never felt that level of peace before or since.
Really?
It really was amazing. And so I think about that sometimes when I'm in a situation that I perceive as scary or especially challenging. And so I think I'm like, what is the absolute worst that could happen? And then I ask myself, would that be so bad? And most of the time, if I've done the right thing to the best of my ability, then whatever the worst thing happens is usually probably okay. So I don't know. I guess that would be the thing that I learned from that situation is like, I've already faced death. It at least felt like it. So I don't know.
What an incredible story. I love that so much. Thank you for sharing that. Wow. I went skydiving myself way back in college. I did not do solo. That would have been terrifying. I'm really, truly terrifying. It was scary enough going tandem, But just a funny anecdote real quick. I remember the waiver that I had to sign. I still remember 20 some odd years later. And it said, we will not be held liable for any injury or death that may occur due to passive or active negligence on our part. Active negligence. Oh. How can they say that?
Oh man. Yes.
But that was in their waiver. Passive or active negligence on it. Oh my gosh. And I signed it, right? So who's the dummy really?
Oh, yeah. You're still in college though, so still learning to think.
I suppose so. Yeah. I hadn't learned to think like an engineer yet, apparently.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Has there ever been a limiting belief that you've held about your role as an engineer, and were you able to overcome it?
Yeah. Coming out of engineering school, I'm sure I had a healthy dose of Dunning-Kruger syndrome, where I thought I knew everything. I've just conquered engineering school, but only to find out that I knew nothing. I was surprised at how dumb I was. And I actually got to the point where even when in a hiring role, I remember telling someone, and I'm almost ashamed of this. I'm like, well, they're a new graduate, so they're not going to know anything. And I thought, wow, how far have we come, Etienne? And so we'll have to train them everything. But once I got to the valley of depression where I'm like, okay, I know nothing, I looked around and I realized that a lot of people were kind of right there with me. A lot of people seemed to be faking it a little bit. They didn't quite know it, but they weren't admitting it. So don't get me wrong, not everyone was there. There were a few people that I genuinely looked up to. They were obvious, masters of their craft. And I think that's what we should all be striving to be, for sure. But I struggled with wondering whether or not I would ever feel like an expert again. I remember telling my wife that. I'd mentioned being a drapery installer, that I actually was. I feel like I was an expert at that, I'd been shipped all over the country, was sent out to help other drapery installers with jobs they were struggling with. So this feeling of being the dumbest person in the room was new to me, and I did not like it. So
sure, yeah.
You asked how I overcame it. I overcame it by deciding, you know what, when I'm in a situation where I'm red-faced because I don't embarrassed that I don't know what we're talking about or I don't understand the situation, I am going to become insanely curious. And you know what? Turns out the more curious you are, the more you can forget about yourself and forget about the fact that you don't understand what's going on. Just be curious about it and ask until you do understand. So it took longer than I care to admit to reach this conclusion as a strategy, but it's been immensely relieving to resort to curiosity.
Wow, that's wonderful. Curiosity. Okay. All right. Let me just do one more and then we'll wrap things up here. Specifically within the context of your role as an engineer, what is one thing that frustrates you and one thing that brings you joy?
Yeah, good question. One thing that frustrates me. I think one thing that frustrates me is the way people sometimes treat engineers. I guess there's an expectation that you know everything. There's that phrase, I don't know exactly why it is, but the frustration with being on the manufacturing role or the engineering with the shop floor where they make fun of you and could be industry specific. The steel industry, they told you how it was, and I learned to respect and appreciate that. And I don't know if it's whoever came before me or what, but that was a frustration. The part that the thing that I appreciate though, it might be similar, is there is an expectation that you know everything. And so you need to live up to that, rise to the challenge and be willing to be the guy who is going to take ultimately what it boils down to is you're the guy who takes the heat. And so you have to be willing to accept that role and to fulfill that role and to actually live up to that role. So I respect it and I appreciate that about what it means to be an engineer, but it's kind of like two sides of the same coin, I suppose.
Yeah, the same answer for both questions. All right.
Yeah.
Well, great, Etienne. This has been such a delight. Thank you so much for sharing some of your background. Love all the stories that you've been able to bring to the table. It's always it makes for such a more entertaining and engaging conversation when there are stories like that involved. So thank you for being willing to share a little bit of your personal life with all of us. How can people get in touch with you?
I'm very active on LinkedIn, so that's probably the best place to find me. If you would like to email me, feel free to email me at etiennnichols@gmail.com might be the best place. But yeah, just hit me up on LinkedIn and happy to chat about whatever.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much, Etienne. Sure appreciate your time today.
All right. Thanks, Aaron.
I'm Aaron Moncur, founder of Pipeline Design and Engineering. If you liked what you heard today, please share the episode. To learn how your team can leverage our team's expertise developing turnkey equipment, custom fixtures, and automated machines, and with product design, visit us at teampipeline.us. Thanks for listening.